Welcome to Eye on Korea, a video podcast produced by the Korea Economic Institute of America. Join us for in-depth conversations with experts and policymakers as we explore issues in Korea's economic and political relationship with the United States and how these issues may influence South Korea's regional strategies and its global relationships. I'm Scott Snyder, President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute, and today I'm joined by Wendy Cutler. Wendy Cutler is Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Managing Director of the Washington, D.C. office. She joined the Asia Society Policy Institute following nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she also served as acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. During her USTR career, she worked on a range of bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade negotiations and initiatives, including the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, U.S.-China negotiations, and the WTO financial services negotiations. Welcome to Eye on Korea, Wendy.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
And maybe we can just start by getting a little update on where things stand in terms of the U.S.-Korea tariff framework and the apparent gap between the two sides.
And that's a great question because I think a lot of people think this is done, but it's not done. In the lead up to the summit meeting between President Lee and President Trump in Washington a few weeks ago, the two sides did agree on an agreement in principle, but nothing was written down. And now after the summit, the two sides have been sitting down trying to agree on something in writing, and that's where a number of difficulties have emerged. And so at this point now, there's no deal between the U.S. and Korea, although efforts continue to try and reach an agreement, particularly in the lead up to the APEC meeting.
And it seems like the situation has gotten even more complicated as a result of the U.S.-Japan agreement, which maybe contains some things that Korea was not anticipating or that Korea does not want to sign up to with the United States.
Correct. So the major sticking point from what I understand in the U.S.-Korea negotiations is the U.S. request for Korea to sign up to a $350 billion investment fund. And as Korea's learned more of the details of what the U.S. is expecting and actually read the memorandum of understanding concluded between Japan and the U.S., I think they are having grave concerns about whether this is something that they can even do. The MOU with Japan covers $550 billion, so it's larger than the sum that's being asked from Korea. However, the process suggests that while there will be some Japanese input into identifying projects for investment in the United States, it's the U.S. and President Trump will be the ultimate decider. And so even if Japan doesn't like a project, they can be overridden by the U.S. They're still expected to give their money to the U.S. and the project to go forward. And then on top of it, 90% of the profits from the project, and that may be down the road, would go to the U.S. So you can see that this, there are a lot of onerous provisions here. And when Korea, my understanding is when they actually read the Japan MOU and heard from the Department of Commerce Secretary Lutnick that this is what they're expected to sign up to, they have raised grave concerns, including the size of the fund for them, $350 billion, which is close to 20% of their GDP. It's clear that this is not talking about loan guarantees. That's what Korea thought the deal when they agreed in principle that they could use loan guarantees to get up to that number. And now they're learning, no, this is more about giving money for these projects. And so, again, I think Korea is having a lot of, a lot of concerns. And I think President Lee went so far as to say, if I were to agree to something like this, I could be impeached.
Yes. No, it's clear there's a big gap. The question really is there a way to narrow that gap? And how do you even begin to try to close the distance on all those provisions that you
right. And to be clear, this is the major sticking point. And my view is if common ground could be found on this part, then the other issues where there's differences probably could be ironed out pretty quickly. Look, I think there is a way to find common ground, but that would require the U.S. to be more flexible and for Korea to be more flexible. And it's unclear to me whether the U.S. is willing to go beyond, a strategy of take it or leave it. Like, this is what we agreed to with Japan. We don't want to make any edits except for the number. It's unclear to me, again, if the U.S. wants to give any breaks or find any flexibilities for Korea to make it easier for them to agree to.
And then the political environment on the Korean side obviously was hugely impacted by the Hyundai raids. Are you detecting from your Korean colleagues how big an impediment is that?
So I happened to be in Korea the week after the raids took place, and it was, we're talking front page story in all the press. And when the workers came back to Korea, they also shared some stories about how they were treated by ICE agents. And some of them did raise some serious questions and are getting a lot of play in Korea. So, on one hand, we are requesting from Korea to invest more in the United States. On the other hand, our visa system has not kept up with those demands to allow Korea to bring in the workers needed to get these plants up and running. It's too early now to say whether this is a major setback or is this something that both sides will find a way forward and kind of move on. I'm encouraged that when the Deputy Secretary of State was in Korea recently, he did apologize for these raids, and we've set up some type of visa working group with Korea to see if we can find a way forward and maybe get them the types of visas they need. I think if that were to happen, which would be, I think, a tremendous show of goodwill on the part of the U.S., that could lead, could just get the investments back on track, and maybe this issue could just be put in the background.
Okay, so basically the first step is really to get things moving again.
Right, and it's unclear. It's one thing to set up a working group and have discussions. It's another issue for the United States to actually move and act on this and make available the types of visas for these Korean workers that are needed.
Yeah, and this is really in the weeds, I guess, but do you have an understanding of what types of visa options there are? Because it sounds like one pathway is through Congress to create a new visa quota for Korean workers, but that there might be some other pathways as well.
I'm not a visa expert. My view is if folks want to find a solution, there's something, that we can find one. But again, this area is so sensitive in the United States as well. And I think for this administration, if they start making big breaks for Korea, for example, then they need to do the same for other countries as well. So I don't know how fast this all can move, but I think until there's more clarity on this issue, I think Korean companies are going to be very cautious about, getting their investments up and running and sending over any workers to work on any of these projects.
Well, the next opportunity to really engage at the highest level is going to be at APEC. What is the message that you think that Korean companies and the Korean president should try to deliver to the Trump administration at that time?
I think what's extremely important is for the Korean government as well as the industry to convey all of the areas of cooperation, potential cooperation between the U.S. and Korea. So, for example, shipbuilding, extremely important. And frankly, $150 billion of that investment fund, over almost half of it, are devoted to shipbuilding projects. And so we're putting a big emphasis on shipbuilding. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be putting in new sanctions against Chinese ships that are making port calls in the U.S. in an effort to not only get, to act against China and their unfair trade practices, but also to try and give incentives to build a domestic industry. And here, cooperation with Korea is going to be critical. So whether it be on shipping or semiconductors or batteries, there's so much we can do together. But unfortunately, some of these issues in the framework agreement are taking center stage and I think precluding our ability to work on these cooperative areas. So I think that is an important message for the Korean president to share with President Trump. But I think he also needs to be frank and to say, we want to do a trade deal with you, but I have certain limits. And, and these are where my limits are. But I want to find, a creative way forward to narrow our differences.
Okay. Well, the further we go in this conversation, the more I'm realizing that there are multiple problems. I want to ask you about the 232, the sectoral sanctions, because many of the areas that you just mentioned are also either subject to already announced sanctions or possible impending sanctions. And so I'm wondering what you see as the greatest risks, which sectors, and what should people anticipate in that area?
Right. So currently, as of today, and this is before October 1, there are three 232 sectors where tariffs are in place. Steel and aluminum, I count as one, autos, and copper. And for autos and steel and aluminum, those are huge areas of export and therefore interest to Korea. Korea, more than anything, really wanted to get both of those tariffs down. They were unsuccessful on steel and aluminum, but at least in the framework agreement in principle that was reached, where there was agreement that if a final deal was reached, then their auto tariff would go down to 15%, putting them on parity with Japan and the EU. But given that the final agreement has not been reached, Korean automakers now face a 25% tariff. They are disadvantaged vis-a-vis their major competitors, Japan and the EU. And this is so ironic because they're an FTA partner, and just 6 months ago, they were facing a zero tariff on autos, while the EU and Japan were facing a 2.5% tariff. But there are other sectoral 232 tariffs that are either been announced or going to go into effect soon or will be announced shortly. And, they're in a whole bunch of sectors. The two sectors probably of greatest concern to Korea would be semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. And so in both of these areas, it seemed that in their in-principle agreement that they were accorded the same treatment as Japan, meaning 15% tariff on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. But again, without an agreement, they'll be subject to the high tariffs that are being on pharmaceuticals. 100% tariff was just announced by the president last week. That would apply to innovative medicines, not generics. But semiconductors is probably the next 232 investigation that will be concluded, and we'll see the results of that. But that could really have a huge impact on Korean semiconductor suppliers.
So that means that the U.S. has a lot of leverage at play in multiple sectors, and Korean companies are facing a drastically different business environment. How long do you think that Korea can last without an agreement, and how much should they actually be willing to put forward in order to get an agreement?
Well, that's a great question. And so, for their negotiating team, they really need to come up, where are we call in the trade world, where are your red lines, right? Where do you have flexibility, and which requests are just there? Which requests can you just not entertain, and you have to tell the other side just cannot do it? And that's something that they'll need to grapple with and to make those types of decisions. For Japan, it's interesting. Japan identified getting the auto tariff down as their number one, number two, and number three priority. And as a result, they were more willing to be open on pursuing an investment fund with the United States. But Korea is interested in autos and semiconductors and steel. And so they have just many more sectoral interests than Japan does. And so they are different in a way. But look, the other thing is if these agreements don't cover some of these 232 tariffs, then Korea and other countries as well are going to need to make that determination. Even if we get the reciprocal tariff down, if these sectoral tariffs are going to be so damaging to us, are these framework deals with the United States really worth it? So far, most major countries have said yes, but I don't think it's out of the question that at some point Korea or other countries may just decide that, you know what, we're better off without an agreement given the types of concessions we're being pressed to make.
Well, I guess stay tuned ends up being the mantra for trade policy these days.
Yeah, but I will say that I still am somewhat optimistic that the U.S. and Korea will find a way forward because we're allies, we're important partners. Again, the U.S. does want Korean cooperation, particularly on semiconductors and shipbuilding, on AI. And so, there are a lot of reasons why the U.S. wants to work with Korea. So I am hopeful that some solution could be found.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I have a couple of other questions I wanted to ask before we close out. One, I know that you wrote an op-ed together with Steve Olson this week that details implications of the USMCA review for Asian investors. And I wonder if you could say something about particular aspects of that review that the Korean side should be looking at closely.
Sure. So the U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement is up for review July 2026. But the process for inviting public comment just started a couple of weeks ago. So in this recent op-ed that I drafted along with my colleague Steve Olson, what we wanted to do was to point out that Asian countries, including Korea, should pay attention to this USMCA review, that given the trade and investment ties Asia has with Mexico, Canada, and the United States, that some of these outcomes of this review and this what's going to turn out to be a renegotiation of the USMCA can impact, in terms of Korea, their investments here, but also their exports to the three countries. And so some of the areas that could impact Korea and other Asian economies are, for example, new rules of origin, which are stricter. These are the rules that determine where a product is from so a tariff can be assigned. And if these rules of origin are designed in a much more restrictive manner, it may mean that little Chinese content is allowed in these products, or that even little Korean or any other foreign content is allowed in these USMCA eligible products. In addition, I think through this renegotiation that the U.S. will be pushing to limit Chinese participation either through investments or through exports, including, again, trying to get Chinese content out of these supply chains. And that gets very difficult for a lot of Asian economies. If you want to ship a final product to Mexico, for example, from Korea, the odds of having some Chinese content are pretty high depending on the product. And so this could have direct impacts on Korean companies. And so the rules of origin, the proposals dealing with Chinese integration in that market, as well as updates to the agreement in areas like digital or labor or other areas may also impact Korean and other Asian companies. So I think it's important that while people look at this USMCA review at first blush as a North American exercise, in reality, given how integrated Asia is into the Mexican, U.S., and Canadian markets, they have strong equities at stake here.
Well, to wrap up, I just want to ask a few questions. We just fielded our annual public opinion survey that KEI does every year. This was our sixth one. Of course, the overall public opinion toward the relationship, American opinion, is pretty supportive. But I thought it was particularly interesting that 68% of Americans say that trade with South Korea is beneficial to the United States, and only 10% are supporting increases in tariff on South Korean goods. I just wanted to get your reaction to that.
I was stunned by that outcome because, there seems to, when Trump talks about how unfair trade is with Korea and all these other countries that have trade surpluses with us, there seems to be a lot of support for that position. And so this seems to be a resounding endorsement of cheap or untarified Korean products coming into the United States. So that's very heartening. I hope you share these results with the White House.
We'll do our best. Another finding that I don't know how they'll receive it though, because another finding that we have is that Americans are not approving of Korea policy currently.
Of U.S. policy towards Korea.
Policy toward Korea. 33% approve, 49% are unsure. So it's really more uncertainty about the direction of the policy, I think. And also the other interesting finding is that in terms of priority, technology and supply chains are right up there with focusing on North Korea and China as threats, actually slightly higher. And so it suggests that the economic dimension of the relationship is becoming more important. And I'd be interested in your response to that.
And I totally agree. I mean, we have seen that over the years that the alliance used to be, before the free trade agreement, the alliance was all about our security ties. And through the FTA, it was expanded to economic ties. And then during the Biden administration, it was expanded to kind of these economic security ties, like working together on supply chains and export controls and strategic products, et cetera. So, I think when people think of Korea now, people are thinking less about North Korea and much more about, these economic issues, and particularly these economic security issues, particularly given, Korea's strength in so many critical and strategic sectors like semiconductors and batteries and autos. And so I think Korea plays a very important role in supply chains. And I think it sounds like Americans are beginning to appreciate that more.
I just want to thank you for joining us today on Eye on Korea, Wendy.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure, Scott.
And thank you for tuning in to Eye on Korea. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss the next one, and leave a review to help others discover the show. Follow the Korea Economic Institute of America on social media or visit keia.org for more resources, events, and expert analysis on Korea. We'll see you next time on Eye on Korea.